Hello everyone, welcome back. This is Module 7 of our course in Foreign Language Teaching Methodology. The title is the Communicative Approach to English Language Teaching. In the last week, in the last module, we were talking about how different methodologies were developed and approaches to looking at methodology. Specifically, we looked at behaviorism and also innatism. We talked about the behaviorist approach, stimulus response, etc., and the innatist approach, the idea of the language acquisition device. We looked at B.F. Skinner on the behaviorist side and Noam Chomsky on the innatist side. Today what we're going to do is to look at these two the methods that came from these ideas. Well, the methods that came from the behaviorist approach and the methods that have been largely influenced by a reaction to the behaviorist approach, that is the communicative approach, sometimes called communicative language teaching. These two terms are used interchangeably. I think the idea of an approach is useful because it's not necessarily a method as much as it is a way of looking at teaching. The communicative approach or communicative language teaching is something that's not always easy to define. It's a very open idea. Therefore, I think it's good to think of it as an approach, not too much as communicative language teaching. So what is communicative language teaching or the communicative approach? These are the four basic tenets, according to Richards and Rogers. Language is a system for the expression of meaning. Okay? The point is to be able to express what you want to say, to get your message across. The primary function of language is to allow interaction and communication. The structure of language reflects its functional and communicative uses. Again, structure is not just grammar to learn, not just phrases to memorize. That those phrases and that grammar have a function in communication. The primary units of language are not merely its grammatical and structural features, but categories of functional and communicative meaning as amplified in discourse. Now, we'll talk a moment again about discourse, this concept. Discourse basically is how language fits together in a text, usually. Often we talk about discourse analysis. Looking at different written texts also can be speaking. Things have to fit together. You have sentences in isolation, but you need to put them together into a text. And they have to not only have meaning, but they have to fit together grammatically and in terms of style. So underpinning the idea of the communicative approach is this concept of communicative competence, which has been developed since 1967 when Delheims famously first put forth the idea. It's broken, over time it's developed somewhat, but there are four basic elements to communicative competence. Sometimes people add additional ones, but these are the four basic ones. The first is grammatical competence, or linguistic competence, which is quite simply knowledge of the linguistic aspect of language, the grammar. The second is sociolinguistic competence, which, as you might imagine, is using language in real communication, in social institutions. So if you are communicating with somebody, you need to use the language appropriately. Discourse competence, we mentioned discourse a moment ago. This is fitting language together into a text. And finally, strategic competence. Now, strategic competence is something that develops throughout learning. And it's not necessarily the same as learning grammar or learning what's appropriate or learning discourse. Strategic competence is something different. It is the ability to use language strategies in order to communicate. So, for example, if you don't know a word, you can use a different word. You can talk around the topic even. You can even change the topic. You can pause. You can say, You can do different things which will continue the communication without interrupting anything. And learners learn different strategies in order to succeed in language. And we all have them. We all use them. Now, today, as I mentioned, we'll be looking at these two methods in more detail, the audiolingual method and communicative language teaching. Remember, the audiolingual method was influenced primarily by behaviorist approach to learning, stimulus, response, reward or punishment, this sort of thing. You remember from last time. On this slide, and the next one, you'll see point-by-point comparisons between these two methods. In the audiolingual side, language learning involves structures. Basically, it was memorizing structures and knowing the structures and getting them right. On the other hand, in CLT, communicative language teaching, you have language learning involves communicating. So the point is not memorizing structures as much as being able to use those structures in communication. Emphasis on structure and form in the audiolingual side, whereas emphasis on meaning in the communicative side. The aim is linguistic competence, and the aim of communicative language teaching is communicative competence, as we just spoke about. So on the one side, the focus is on grammar and knowledge of vocabulary. The other side is being able to use that knowledge in communication. Now, in the behavioral mode and audiolingual method, errors must be prevented at all costs. And the reason for this is because, according to behaviorist learning theory, if you make a mistake and it's not corrected, then it might become a habit. And that's how you learn, through forming habits. So at all costs, we need to avoid mistakes. On the other hand, as you know probably from your teaching, we encourage students to speak and make mistakes. This is communicative, and errors are part of language learning. Again, on the left we have the audiolingual side. Teachers must specify what language a student will use. Teachers have to strictly control things, because if you don't control what the teacher says, then the students might make mistakes. Through making mistakes, they develop habits, sometimes good, but often bad, and that's difficult to remove. Now, on the communicative side, teachers cannot know what language a student will use. This is because in communication, you have to be creative. So things are going to happen. Students are going to invent phrases, ideas, and they're going to use things they may not feel 100% confident with. But that's good, and we encourage that, because that's how we learn. On the behavior side again, the audiolingual side, students must interact with the language. On the other hand, students must interact with people on the communicative side. On behaviors, accuracy is a primary goal. Get it right. On the other hand, in communicative, fluency is a primary goal. Fluency. Language is habit according to the audiolingual method, whereas language is creation in communicative language teaching. Teachers control the learners. On the other hand, teachers assist the learner. Okay? These are important to think about as you look at these methods and as you look at different teaching methods. One very strictly controlled, teacher-centered. The other still teacher-involved, but teachers assisting, student-centered or learner-centered. Now, this week, in the readings you had for last week, there were two readings, as you remember, Paul Knight and Jeremy Harmer. And these four methods that I've listed on the screen here were discussed. They're humanistic methods. They're approaching language from the learner's side, from the human side. So different elements are involved, psychological, emotional, etc. Also intellectual, cognitive development, but focused on the learner. And the four I listed here of these methods, the same four that are discussed in the readings, are the silent way, community language learning, suggestopedia, and total physical response, or TPR. Now, these four methods are not methods that you see in practice very often. You certainly see elements of them. Particularly, I think TPR is very popular with beginners. A lot of people use it, or elements of that method. But that doesn't mean that they're not worth looking at. In a historical context, they are very much so, because they represent movement away from tradition. Okay? And a lot of the things that were developed in these methods, a lot of the approaches in these methods are carried on in other areas. And I think it's even possible to use some of the techniques, some of the procedures in these methods in your own teaching. I don't know anybody who would want to adopt them 100% and stick to them absolutely, but they're worth looking at and they're worth thinking about, and some elements might be worth integrating into your approach to teaching. It's also worth noting that even in the context where they have tried to apply these methods 100%, they rarely do. In fact, research shows that teachers who say they are focused 100% on a method and using only that method, when they actually go and look at the classes they teach, look at the interaction with the students and material, they find that they're not completely loyal to a method. They're always using a more eclectic approach, combining different elements. So I think instead of pretending you're using a method, it's probably better, knowing that this is the case, it's probably better to start with a more eclectic approach to teaching rather than a strict adherence to a single method. But we're looking at these from a historical point of view, but also from a practical point of view for ourselves. We need to know about our teaching history, but also the history of our profession, but also we need to know what is useful to us as teachers and what is useful to our profession in the future. So that's why we bother looking at them. And that's why they may or may not be useful to us depending on our needs, on our context. I was sending you an assignment, and in that assignment you'll look at these 4 methods, and in the 2 readings that I mentioned before, in Harmer and in Knight, and I'll ask you to complete the assignment based on those readings. You may find additional materials on the internet. Of course, you'll find a lot of things on the internet about these 4 methods. So if you need to do more research, I suggest you go there and try to find some summaries. Just to review a bit, and this is always something good to keep in mind when you're looking at methods, okay, which you'll be doing the next week. Now, I've put up 2 slides. The first one is, again, from Richards and Rogers, and I had this up in the last presentation as well. This is a method is broken down into 3 elements: the approach, the design, and the procedure. In the approach, we're looking at the theory of the nature of language, also the theory of the nature of language learning. Okay, what is language? How do you describe language? And then also, how is language learned? And the design aspect of Richards and Rogers' approach to examining methods is you have the design. That this is the general and specific objectives of the method, the syllabus, the types of activities, critically the learner roles, the teacher roles, and the role of instructional materials. Again, as I mentioned last time, I'm not going to read everything that's written here, but I encourage you to spend some time looking at this, studying it, because though you may not agree with their interpretation of method and how to describe it, what they've written here is a very good overall analysis of what's contained within an approach, a method to teaching. In the procedure aspect, we have classroom techniques, practices, and behaviors when the method is used. Again, that's the application, the actual classroom application of the method itself, based on the design, which is based on the approach. So, techniques, practices, and behaviors when methods used, these are the resources, the interactional patterns, and the strategies. It's actually what you do in the classroom. Finally, I put the triangle back up again, just to remind you of these 3 basic elements. So as you're looking at methods for this week and also any other method, and considering teaching in general, always remember the triangle. Remember you have 3 elements. You have the teacher, the student, and the material, and the interaction between these 3 elements on the triangle. Okay, that's all for this week. Thanks for listening. I will be in touch. As usual, materials will be posted on Libri and an email. And please feel free to contact me with any questions, and I'll be back in touch soon. Bye for now.